won the game.
They did it! They did it! They did it!
And they're going crazy. They're jumping on each other.
One of the most unbelievable finishes you will ever see.
And welcome to it. Thanks for being with us here on Orioles Magic, the podcast presented by Miller Lite. Brett Hollander, Geoff Arnold, ready to talk some MLB draft. And Geoff, needless to say, for us baseball star folk, we're excited about the draft every year. But this year, without the game in the backdrop of it, and without any games going on right now, I mean, usually sandwiched between, everything from the College World Series to the NBA playoffs or finals, NHL, Stanley Cup, whatever, and the day-to-day baseball games. Baseball is standing alone this week to make a splash.
And the Orioles certainly hope to make one too. And Jonathan Mayo, who we talked to on our podcast today, seems to think it'll probably be Austin Martin. You have that group of Torkelson, Martin, and Asa Lacy who you figure are going to be your top three picks. And those figure to be pretty locked in. And given the way that the Tigers have gone in their recent drafts with pitching and what Torkelson presents with bat being as good as it is, he would go number one, and then you figure Martin would be your second type of pick. And Jonathan Mayo spoke very highly about him and, the bat, the instincts, how he could maybe be a plus defender if he was to go to the outfield for the Orioles. Didn't really seem as maybe concerned about the arm part, which I'd heard maybe, led to some reasons for concern. And when you read some of the mock drafts, those point those out too. But I think either way, the Orioles can be pretty confident that they're going to get a great player at number 2, and then they should get a couple of other great players at 30 and 39, and that should certainly elevate their overall rankings as far as maybe MLB.com or whatever, their farm system to maybe a team in around the top 5.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. You'd love to hear they have 2 top 100 prospects out of this. You would figure whomever they get at 2 is going to be a top 50 prospect day 1. But let's get to it. We cover everything about this draft in the Orioles with Jonathan Mayo. And joining us right now on Orioles Magic, the podcast presented by Miller Lite, is Jonathan Mayo from MLB.com and MLBpipeline.com, and a huge part of MLB Network's coverage this week of the 2020 Baseball Amateur Draft. Coverage on the 10th begins at 7 p.m. in full. Of course, the Orioles picking early and often in this thing, including number 2 overall. And Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure.
Well, let's start with this second pick. I mean, obviously, we've been following the mocks like crazy. Would Martin be your final pick for the Orioles if you had to predict it out?
Yeah, at this point, I still would be going with Austin Martin from Vanderbilt. There's not been enough for me to feel that I would want to make a change. I know there's been a lot of buzz about a couple of other players, Asa Lacy, the lefty from Texas A&M, Nick Gonzalez has been brought up. I think Zach Veen's name, the high schooler from Florida, has been brought up. All is sort of like, if we want to save money and then use it later on. Right now, I still see that more as smoke screens. And, could it happen? Sure. Things could fall apart. It should be noted that Austin Martin is represented by Scott Boras Corp. So you never know what can happen, in terms of negotiations there. But by and large, his guys, when they get taken at the top, they sign. So, I'm not overly concerned. I think if you're picking number 2, you take the best player, period. Trying to manipulate the draft up there can often be a mistake. And I think when all is said and done, if they decide that Austin Martin is clearly the best player, that's the direction they'll go in.
To you, what do you like the most about Austin Martin when you've had a chance to see him play?
Who's gotten a chance to see him play, man? I mean, this is right. It's obviously there are a few things that stand out. The first and foremost, from a tool standpoint, is the bat. I mean, he's the best pure hitter in the class. His ability to barrel up the baseball, he makes consistent contact, draws walks, he doesn't strike out. There's some impact there. I mean, he's not like a huge power guy. There might be a little more pop, as he matures, but he's going to be a big extra base guy. And then the other thing that stands out is just kind of the way he goes about it. He's just a supremely confident guy. He's a leader. His makeup is kind of off the charts. So I think those are the two things that stand out. Now, I know like people want to sort of say, well, we don't know where he's going to play defensively. I don't see that as a negative. One, because positional flexibility now is a good thing. And I think gone are the days where you should worry about a guy, if we pick a guy number 2 overall and he's a super utility guy, is that okay? You know, if he moves around and he's in the lineup 150 times, who cares? You know, that said, I think he could very easily be an everyday second baseman. And there are people who think that he could be a plus defender in center field when all is said and done. You know, this year was the first year he really played out there, and his instincts were outstanding. Tim Corbin, his coach at Vanderbilt, just raved about how almost automatically he was good at just going and getting the ball and understanding the play in front of him and things like that without a whole lack of reps.
I guess, the last year the Orioles picking at 1 had their pick of the litter, and, maybe I'm not going to say it was a slam dunk, but most people had it as Adley Rutschman going number 1. The question about Torkelson this year, is that as much of a slam dunk for Detroit at 1, and then the Orioles make their pick off of that?
It's pretty close. I mean, and it was a slam dunk. I mean, Adley Rushman last year was a slam dunk. I don't care what anybody tells you. Like, sure, you do due diligence because you don't know what might happen. Again, negotiations, you want to make sure, but I don't think there was any question. I think for this year, the Tigers have been very coy. I don't have any inside information, but everyone thinks they're taking. I haven't even heard they may do, something crazy. And I know, the caveat is that a right-handed first baseman has never been taken number 1 overall, but he's such a special offensive player that it does seem that it's pretty close to a slam dunk. And sometimes in those situations, picking number 2 is a great place if you think it's 1 and 1A. Like last year, the Royals were thrilled because I think a lot of people internally like Bobby Witt as much as Adley Rushman, and you could make an argument that Bobby Witt was the best player in last year's draft. Just a little further away, I wouldn't. I still would have taken Adley Rushman. I don't want to hear from all the crazy Orioles fans. I love Adley Rushman, but the Royals were like, the decision is made for us, right? Like we love Bobby Witt, and we're happy he's a franchise type player, just like Adley is. And I think that this year there are maybe you could make the argument that if you wanted to go with an arm, Asa Lacy has kind of separated himself. But by and large, it's been a Torkelson-Martin conversation, and by picking 2, the Orioles can let the Tigers make the decision for them.
For Martin, how much of a concern should there be over the arm?
If you thought that he was going to be a shortstop, then there was a concern. If you wanted to send him out as a shortstop and see if he can work through it, a lot of it is mechanical. And then it becomes a mental thing. I mean, we've all seen guys that have had trouble throwing. But I wouldn't even worry about that. I think his arm has been fine from center field. It's not like he's not 4-hopping balls to, or overthrowing cutoff men. I don't really see him as a third baseman. I'm not even sure that the offensive profile works perfectly there. Could he play there? Sure. But I think second base he'd be just fine. And then center field, it's been good. So either way, you have a guy who's going to play up the middle, who's going to hit, I don't know, is he a batting title kind of guy who hits 20 homers? Yeah, I could see that. Then who cares what his arm is? Unless, if it were so bad that, you have no place for him to play, then it's thing. But it's not anywhere close to that kind of level of concern.
Jonathan, because the Orioles do have, and I know you're not drafting for need at 2, but the Orioles, if you look at their outfield and pitching prospects, things look pretty good right now, but there's definitely an emptiness, it feels like, in the infield. So to add, whether Martin's at second or maybe it's Nick Gonzalez, what is his profile like out of New Mexico State? Maybe just comparing those 2 offensively together.
Sure. They're pretty close, I think, offensively. I think Gonzalez may have a little more present power. It's hard to know because of where he played his games, but he hit over the summer. He's going to hit. And he's a solid defender. I don't think there's all that much separating them. I think Martin is a tiny bit better of a pure hitter, and he was doing it in the SEC. And I think that's the only, in terms of evaluating, not taking anything away from the competition that Gonzalez faced, but the slight maybe downtick in competition and playing at altitude certainly inflated his numbers, but he hit everywhere. And, the only real difference is that he's only a second baseman. He plays shortstop this year for New Mexico State, but he's not going to play shortstop at all. I think that, he's more of an offensive-minded second baseman. I think that Martin may be a tick more athletic, which is why there's a chance to have him play center field, if that's what you need him to do. Now, if I'm the Orioles, I'd probably send him out on the dirt and see what happens, knowing he'd be just fine out there if you needed to move around. And you're right, the not drafting for need is important because his bat is so good, you find a home for it, regardless of what your other pieces are, knowing that's not going to take him in all likelihood that long to be big league ready because the bat is so fast.
It sounds like the Orioles are pretty content on taking Martin. If they were going to take a pitcher, you'd assume it would be Asa Lacy. But when you look at Emerson Hancock, how much of a difference is there between where Lacy is and where Hancock would end up?
I mean, I think we have them one apart in our talent rankings. So I've heard some things that some of the analytic data on Hancock wasn't as good, spin rate, that kind of stuff. But guy was the best pitcher in college baseball last year, in the best conference of college baseball last year. So, he broke out of the gate a little bit slowly this year. And then his last start before the shutdown was 7 shutout, I think 1 hit, 12 strikeouts, right? So, I don't think there's all that much separating. It's funny because there's probably a little more track record of success, especially in terms of commanding the baseball with Hancock. Lacy is one of the few guys who probably helped separate himself with how he pitched this spring because every start he was dominant. He kind of took a step forward, always had good stuff. Command was the issue, and he was throwing a lot more strikes, a lot more quality strikes this year, and I think that's what separated him. And the fact that he's left-handed always is a nice bonus.
If the Orioles are deciding between an offensive player and a pitcher, my guess is they'd probably go pitcher if they thought that pitcher had a chance to be a pretty good bet for a frontline guy. Do you see Lacy or Hancock as pretty good bets to being frontline type starters in the American League East?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the chance for either of them both to sort of fill that role. I mean, they were Friday night starters at big programs. I think they like having the ball as being thought of as that frontline guy. I don't like using the word ace, especially when you get to the big leagues because there aren't that many true aces. And listen, sometimes guys that you don't think have that ceiling, I think of Aaron Nola, who kind of is now an ace type of guy, and he looked sort of like a number 3 type guy. But so you don't know what might happen once they get to the pro game, right? Emerson Hancock has a cutter and suddenly is, at a different level or something like that. But both of them do have the combination of stuff and future command where they look like they should have a chance to pitch, close to the front of a rotation. Did I throw enough qualifiers on that?
Yeah, you did. That's good.
Woo!
You kind of talked about this earlier, you have a pretty good sense of what the Orioles are going to do and kind of ignoring the smoke screens a little bit. One person that our colleague Ben McDonald, who does a lot of college baseball, is highlighted is Heston Kjerstad. He's seen him play at Arkansas. What have you seen out of him?
Yeah, he can really mash. And I think the thing that really stands out for Kjerstad is that it's clear that he wants to be more than just a power guy. Right? Because he came out his freshman year and hit, 18, 19 homers? I don't have the numbers in front of me. I think a lot of guys would have been like, I just hit 18 homers as a freshman in the SEC. I'm good, right? And then he came out his sophomore year and he did it again. And there were questions in and around that power output with swing and miss. The strikeout rate was a little too high. And then he goes and pretty much leads Team USA in every offensive category and just was really, really good. And then carried that over, one, in how he looked in the fall when scouts were checking him out. And then they played about 16 games this spring. He clearly had made some adjustments. And we talked to him on another preview show for the network, and how he had really concentrated on seeing more pitches, drawing more walks, his 2-strike approach, being content with 2 strikes to go the other way. And he admitted, like, listen, his freshman and a lot of his sophomore year, he would just swing out of his shoes. Like, let's see how far I can hit it. What kid doesn't want to do that? The power is legitimate. And I think one of the things that he's learning, and I think the summer helped him, is that he's going to get to the power. If he works on becoming a better overall hitter, that's actually going to make him a better power hitter overall. And I think that is what makes him much more interesting. And one of the things that we were talking about is that I think that he's a guy that had the spring gone on and he continued to do what he was doing, then maybe you would be hearing him up closer to the top. Because then suddenly if he's not the pure hitter that Austin Martin is, he's closer with Torkelson type power.
Just for the record, no, I don't think any of us think it's going to happen, but just your profile of Florida high school outfielder Zach Veen, just in case the Orioles get a little wild on Wednesday night.
Well, why don't I record a bunch of things that you're going to take them, and then you can say, whoa, Mayo really nailed it.
Just for the record.
Sure. No, absolutely. Listen, Zach Veen's a really good player. He is the one high schooler that, fairly certain is going to go in the top 10. And it's interesting because over the summer, he was really good. He wasn't phenomenal. I don't know that he was ever the best player. Like at different times, like Austin Hendrick from here, my home in Pittsburgh, was really good at the beginning and then kind of faltered. But Veen was kind of just consistently good. And then, through some of the fall events, and again, because he's in Florida, actually went out this spring and showed more of that. He's tall and lanky, shows the ability to leverage the ball now. There's going to be probably more power. You guys have probably seen some of the comps: Cody Bellinger, Christian Yelich. These are all guys that we didn't know would have the power that they've ended up having. Bellinger, you sort of could see it maybe more, and he wasn't as big of a prospect. Yelich, I remember I saw him in high school. He could really, really hit, but I didn't know that he was going to, have this kind of power. Local scouts kind of seek a lot of Kyle Tucker on him. So tall, lanky, there's power. He's athletic. If you think he can play center field, then that puts him at another level. I think he eventually moves over to a corner. Would he be good enough to play center? Yeah, but I think he's that kind of guy that he could play center, but there's likely to be someone who's maybe a little more athletic, better, and then he could be a really athletic, say right fielder, plenty of arm, really exciting player with a lot of offensive upside. I think he's a guy who's hit over power right now, and if he stays that way, he's really good. And then if the power starts to show up more, which I think most people expect given his frame and how he leverages his swing now, then that's why his name is even being mentioned at all as a top 5 pick. And he could very easily go 4 or 5 in this draft if there isn't one of those funky deals that never actually happened in the top couple picks.
We know that the depth as far as the college players is really good. In terms of high school players, how would you evaluate it for this year?
I think it's good, but not great. I think that there's some really, really good high school bats, like in that first round pool. And then there's another tier after that. I think that there's a really good trio of high school arms that are first round talents. And then there's that second tier. And that's that tier that, like with the shortened draft, I'm not sure what happens with. I don't think it's as good as it's been in other places. It's one of these interesting things where people keep asking me about the shortened draft and how that will help college players. And it's a college heavy draft anyway. So it kind of fits in like a jigsaw puzzle kind of nicely.
Jonathan, looking at this Orioles system right now, and they're going to add something special at 2, at least on the surface, and then they have a shot at 30 and 39 as well. Combining it with last year's draft and Rushman at 1 overall, and you're talking about D.L. Hall, Grayson Rodriguez, Ryan Mountcastle's been in some top 100s over the last few years. Yusniel Diaz has been in some top 100s, Austin Hayes, Hunter Harvey. When you kind of look at the scope of it, to add something at 2 and 30 here, I mean, what are we talking about when, let's say, this draft is over for this Orioles system as we talk right now? Is this a top 7, 8, 9 system, adding maybe a Martin at 2 and Rushman at 1 last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good chance of that. And I don't have I don't even have our organizational rankings.
Sure.
So I don't remember where they are, but I mean, that's the idea, right? Like when you pick up at the top of the draft, you're supposed to then become one of the better farm systems. And it's not just about the one guy that you take. It's how you do throughout the draft. Now, this draft won't allow you to bring in that much depth because it's only 5 rounds, but they could get 3 quality future big leaguers with those first 3 picks, or guys that are considered to be, then that should move them up, markedly, just like last year's draft moved them up markedly. And it wasn't, it was last year's draft along with the advancement of some of those guys that you brought up. Grayson Rodriguez took a huge step forward. Everyone knew that he was talented, but I don't think anyone expected him to have the first full season that he did. DL Hall's always had a good arm. He started to put it together a little bit more. So I think that the combination of elite level impact players and some depth, which has sorely been lacking, some of that was addressed in the Manny trade, and they brought in some quality guys, and I'm always happy to talk about my friend from Team Israel. So, he's one of my favorite players of all time. But he's the kind of guy that isn't an elite level guy, but I think he's a big league starter. And
Dean Kramer, you're talking about.
Yeah, Dean Kramer. I didn't think I needed to mention Dean Kramer. Everyone knows Dean.
We saw him pitch in Sarasota just a few, it feels like a lifetime ago, but he was pretty impressive.
It's the kind of thing that I think he probably would be impacting the big league rotation this year had there been a regular season.
Yeah.
See what happens. But he's a guy who's real close, maybe doesn't have a huge ceiling. But if you told me that he settled into the middle of a rotation and gave you 180 to 200 innings every year for the next however many years, yeah, I believe it. So, and that's the kind of depth that I'm talking about. A non-top 100 guy who's going to end up being not just a guy who touches the big leagues, but as a contributor to turning things around.
Kind of sticking with the pitching theme, some of the mocks that I've looked at when it comes to like pick number 30 would have the Orioles going with a pitcher. Do you see them maybe taking a pitcher with that pick after they pick the number 2 pick?
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the things that leads to these theories that they're going to try to save money, that there's going to be one of these maybe high school arms that gets to number 30 and that they can save some money. I don't know what Austin Martin's number is going to be. He's not going to go back to college, right? So maybe that's slot. And then they still could be aggressive and save a little money at 39 or vice versa, right? So does, Mick Abel or Nick Bitsko, or Jared Kelly, those are the trio of high school arms. One of them there at 30? Maybe. Is there a guy like JT Ginn who's coming off of Tommy John surgery but as a first-round arm? Maybe. The one thing that there's a depth, we talked about college, it's such a deep pool of college pitching that they could aggressively go after someone at 30 that they have to pay more for and get a good college arm at 39 who's got a starter profile. A guy like Tommy Mace from the University of Florida comes to mind. Or maybe, and that's a right around the neck of the woods where he could go, so that, I think that's a distinct possibility because there's such a pool there that even in the 3rd round, there might be a solid college arm for them to go after. So maybe if there's a bat that surprisingly hung around, that's why you have to adjust. Like they may have in their mind, we're going to get one of those guys. And then Ed Howard, he's a high school shortstop from Illinois, has been really hard to place because he's got a ton of tools, had an uneven summer, and he's from Chicago. So he didn't play an inning of baseball this spring. So you couldn't follow up to see how he looked. It's been hard for me to figure out where to put him on my mocks. So he could be there at 30. Maybe the Orioles didn't think he was going to be there at 30. Well, Ed Howard's here. How can we pass that up? Then they adjust, knowing especially that there's some pitching depth later on that they can go after if they want to.
It's the Wild West. I mean, we really don't know what to expect with these seasons that have been wiped out. Just out of curiosity, if this was an imaginary world and it was Torkelson and Rushman as a prospect choice, who would you go with that in a hypothetical situation there if they were both out at the same year?
Rushman. I mean, that's it, just because of the position. I think offensive profile-wise, they're pretty similar. You want to make the argument that maybe Torkelson could be a touch more productive because he's not squatting for 9 innings, every day. But because Rushman it's not just, he's a catcher. This isn't Mike Piazza behind the plate. It's, Joe Mauer behind the plate with Mike Piazza's offense. Then to me, that's and I think I answered an inbox question like that a while ago. Like if I were to stack them up, they may have even put Bobby Witt ahead of Torkelson, again because of the position, but also just to see what kind of reaction I would get. I think Jim Callis said that he would probably put Torkelson ahead of Witt, and I could see it. I think you can make an argument either way, but I had Rushman one.
It's very hard, I guess, to determine, how things are going to go with $20,000 signees after you get through the 5 rounds of the draft. What is your gut feeling telling you about what the market is going to be and the types of players that are going to be out there?
Man, I wish I knew. I mean, I have no idea how that's going to work. It's unlike anything. It's like free market with a hard cap, right? So, if I'm a player and I'm willing to sign for 20,000, you could just decide which organization among 12, right? It's a free agent market, but there's no bidding war, right? So a team with a ton of financial resources could sign 150 players and be like, whatever, and end up cutting 80% of them after a summer. Like I have no idea how it's going to work. I think there's going to be a fair amount of activity. I think that's where you're going to see the college seniors sign, and maybe a lot of the college juniors who feel like they don't have a spot for them. I mean, college baseball, I don't know what college baseball is going to look like in the spring, because so many guys may want to come back, and you have this incoming class. And I've talked to some college coaches. They're like, it's chaos, right? They're trying to sort out what it's going to look like for them with only so many scholarships. So you'll probably see some college juniors. I don't think you're going to see any high schoolers sign for $20,000 unless they just have no interest in college. I think the junior college ranks next year might look really good, because you might see some of those guys say, all right, well, I can't do this. Let me see if Chipola or Young Harris in Georgia, or one of these really good Sanjak in Texas, they may have a lot more guys that they could possibly consider, which could lead to a really good 2021 draft class.
Well, Jonathan, I always feel bad for you. Somewhere between rounds like 15 and 40, and coming up with something on every single player going back many years. I guess you're off the hook a little bit in 2020.
Yeah, well, to be fair, so day 3, which is always round 11 through 40, that's not pick by pick. Thank God. No, I'd quit if that happened. I'd be like, no. Luckily there's like they do the conference call, and then we come on after like 10 rounds and talk about a few players, and that's it. Day 2, when we're doing pick by pick through rounds 10, this is pure insanity. I mean, that's there's that point. And I remember years ago, I always give Jim credit because most people may not realize this, but Jim's not actually a human being. And I used to think that, right? I mean, just because his not only his knowledge, but his recall is insane. And he really does so much work to have as many guys at the ready as possible. The biggest sigh of relief I ever breathed on a draft broadcast is we were doing day 2, and he said, I have to admit, I don't know who this player is. And I was like, oh my God, because I thought that like 3 rounds ago. So thank you. No, but it's one of the things we would get into the habit of making that announcement at the beginning of day 2. Hey, we're going to get to a point pretty soon, because we now recognize, we didn't that first year, the sort of senior palooza that happens, that especially after the 5th round, that we're not gonna recognize names, and we put a call out to scouts to say, hey, hit us up, let us know, and we'll backtrack, because we want to give each kid his due. If we're going to do the pick by pick, we want to say something about each player. It's just that it's impossible to know that many players. So it'll happen, on day 2, 3rd round, 4th round, whenever it is, when we don't know a player. But it won't be as much. It's really around 6 through 10 where we start going like, oh man, like we need to go back and talk about 5 players ago that we missed. So I don't think that'll happen as much. We'll still have to rely on scouts for some of it, I'm sure.
In terms of the college game, because next year looks like a total mess. We've seen over the course of this pandemic, some teams dropping their programs, scholarships are going to be cut. You're going to have a whole log jam and everything. What is college baseball going to look like for you, at least in 2021? Because it just seems like a total mess right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's another. I keep answering your questions with questions, right? Because I don't know the answer. I heard talk from some programs, especially ones that are more known for their football. Like, if there isn't football and the revenue that comes with that, could baseball be in trouble? Maybe. I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be football in some regard. So hopefully come the spring, all the programs can have baseball. Now, as I touched on earlier, we're going to have to see how this draft plays out and how many guys are willing to sign for $20,000. I heard some talk that like teams were approaching the college program saying like, we'll take these guys. We'll take these guys off your hands. So I think hopefully it'll work out where the players that would be in question, like maybe there wouldn't be a spot for them, can then decide to go on and sign if there's some opportunity for them to play. I have no idea what that part looks like. There's been a lot of talk about contracting some in the minor leagues, and that would include some of the rookie levels and short season baseball. Is there going to be some sort of developmental league kind of thing for some of these players? I don't know. And all of that, that's on the pro side, but that feeds into what are these kids going to do in terms of going back and wanting to play another year of college baseball. I mean, even I was talking to a scout in the Northeast about whether or not it was a college program in the Northeast, whether this player would go back. He's like, there's a guy coming in the recruiting class who's better than he is, who's going to take a spot. Now, this is the kind of guy who, I think he's a senior, and you normally would be like maybe an interesting college performer senior sign. Is he going to go back for a fifth year, but there's no place for him to play? Like, I don't know what that guy is going to do. So there are more questions than answers, unfortunately.
And Jonathan, obviously a lot of questions about this big league season as we record right now. But assume for a second, and this is not a big assumption, I don't think, for the Orioles, that they have a tough wins and losses season, and they're in the same conversation, the top three again. For Orioles fans who are already excited about next year's draft, if you were to mock it up next week after this one's over, would it be Kumar Rocker at 1 right now? Is he the early indication of that?
Thank God you're only asking me about 1, because if you ask me beyond 1, I know. You know what? Jack Leiter. Well, we'll put Al Leiter's kid, right?
Okay, those two.
Well, with the way he broke out of the gate this spring, where he went from being like a interesting kind of touch and feel. I mean, I really liked him as a high schooler. His commitment to school was really strong, and he was going to be a draft eligible sophomore. So he was pretty much unsignable, and kind of more or less told teams like, don't bother taking me early. Now maybe if he had gone in the first round, it would have been different. I think Al wanted him to go to school. He took a big step forward stuff wise. He got stronger, so I think teams that picking at the top are going to be spending a lot of time at Vanderbilt. I mean, they do anyway. So I think those would be the top two. But you bring up an interesting point, Brett, is that I haven't heard any talk. Like, let's say there's a 40. I mean, how many games is this year going to be? 45. We're playing fantasy here because right now it's not looking so good, right, in terms of them coming to agreement. But are they going to really use a 45-game season to decide the draft order next year? Now, I don't know choice. I don't know if that would have to be collectively bargained again. I honestly, I don't know how any of that works. I've not seen that brought up. I would imagine that whatever season they have, if there is one, they will have to use that. But let's say it's like they can only agree on some sort of round-robin tournament in a playoffs, and that's it. I mean, I would almost say that they should go back to last year, in which case the Orioles are in the same spot anyway. So I think, long answer is yes, the Orioles will probably be picking at or near the very top.
I'll tell you this: if they do some sort of NBA lottery ball system, and the Yankees or Red Sox wind up with rocker or lighter, I'm going to be very, very discouraged about the future of the game. Let's put it. I'll put it as mildly as I can right there. Somehow the Yankees wind up with Kumar Rocker.
I don't think that those teams would qualify for a ping pong ball, right?
Fair enough. I need to know that.
There used to be such a fear that those top guys would get like driven down, and it did happen on occasion where
sure.
it would be like, hey, I even saw a clip of the Ken Griffey Jr. documentary that's going to be on MLB Network in a few weeks about how they talked about, should he say, no, I'm only going to sign with this team, so don't draft me, because I think his dad was playing with the Braves. So they had a conversation, well, should we try to drive you down to the Braves? And Junior was like, well, but you can only be number one pick once, right? So there's only so many guys who can say that. And that's how that's how that ended up working out. And kudos to him for not trying to game the system. But that's happened,
And we know that story around here all too well when it comes to the Baltimore Colts and John Elway and stories like that. And of course, the Yankees very much involved in that as well. But
right. So
we know that story.
Yeah, and it hasn't happened, since they've gone to this bonus pool system. It hasn't really happened. You hear talk like, oh, well, I'm not going to sign. I need to sign for this. There have been enough teams that have said, screw it, I'm taking you. I think there was some talk with, oh my God, I'm blanking on his name now. And I did a whole story on the kid from South Jersey, the high school kid, Jay Groom. He was the high school lefty being mentioned at the top, and all of a sudden we started hearing his name, and we think that they were trying to push him down, and the Red Sox were like, we're taking him, and you're going to have to decide. And they didn't, I think they paid him slot, right? They didn't go over. But what's a kid going to do? He wasn't really interested in going to college. It's life-changing money. So he signed, So I think these days that doesn't happen because there are enough teams in between the Orioles of the world and the Yankees of the world that say, I'm going to take him. And, you decide you want to go back for your senior year of college. I guess Mark Appel would be the one example where he didn't sign, that I think most kids are going to end up signing.
Last one for me. What have you been hearing from teams as they do this draft in a digital fashion, very much like the NFL draft?
Yeah, I think they've been ready for a while. It's like they were really waiting just for the announcement of how many rounds. Once things got shut down and they realized that they were going to be largely relying on evaluations from the summer, and as much video as they could look at, they were kind of ready to go. They just needed to know how to line up their board based on how many rounds there were going to be in the draft, because it would look different, 10 rounds versus 5 rounds. Now, every team from a scouting standpoint would have preferred 10, because then that's kind of like a regular draft. You get talent in the 11th round and maybe you go after, but by and large, it's the same as it's been the last several years. This is different. I think you have to reprioritize what you're able to get and what you can't get. Teams that forfeited picks either for free agent signings or being penalized in some of the cheating scandals, have to plan differently also. The Red Sox pick in the first round and then they don't pick again until the third round. And then they have 2 other picks. That's it. So once they found that out, then they could start lining up their boards. They've been doing a lot of Zoom interviews with players. In some ways, they're more equipped in terms of higher ups understanding the makeup of a kid in a one-on-one conversation, because you wouldn't bring 30 guys in for a private work, for a workout to your stadium where you get to talk to them. So the benefit is, I think, because of the ability to meet like we're meeting right now, they may have a better sense of the kid that they want to take on that front, even if they don't have as much data or scouting reports of them on the field as they normally do.
Jonathan Mayo, MLB Network, MLB.com and MLBpipeline.com. Big week of coverage coming up on MLB Network in what is really, as far as sports fans are concerned, the only game in town right now. The MLB draft takes center stage. Jonathan, you'll get some sleep later in the week. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks for not putting any extra pressure on me with that. That's the biggest game in town.
It's the World Series right now, as far as baseball is concerned.
Yeah.
Jonathan, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic stuff with Jonathan Mayo from MLB Network and MLB.com and MLBpipeline.com. All right, Geoff, it's prediction time. Who do the Orioles take it to?
I say Austin Martin. You take somebody with a great bat, great plate discipline, can possibly play a bunch of different positions, can be an everyday player for your team, has a pedigree of having gone to Vanderbilt, having played baseball on its biggest stages, and who ought to fit in pretty nicely with taking Adriel Rushman a year ago.
I absolutely love the idea of taking Rutschman and then Martin, two guys who have College World Series rings, shined on the biggest stage in the biggest programs. And I know for a lot of fans who don't follow college baseball, you have to appreciate the intensity of that level of college baseball. They are not playing in front of empty stadiums. In the intensity level of SEC baseball and what Adley had at Oregon State, I mean, that is big time, high leverage baseball. And they did it throughout the College World Series. And anyone who's ever seen that tournament and that championship play out in Omaha, that's big time stuff. And those two guys have been the leaders of their teams, and they've come up big in the biggest spots. So it sounds cliche. I absolutely love that. But I do think, Geoff, just to be a contrarian, I think there's a real chance of Asa Lacy here. I don't know why. I think you get a chance to draft a left-handed frontline starter out of college, someone who can move rather quickly, and you can maybe pencil in near the top of your rotation. I think that's going to be really hard to pass up. So just to be a contrarian, I say Lacy at 2. And I say the Orioles, there's apparently, and I'm not an expert at it, a lot of college shortstops who could fall to 30. And clearly a need of this organization. They need some infield depth in this farm system, guys who they can pencil in a few years playing second or short. And I think they find that guy at 30. I mean, that is that's my gut right now. I'm going to say it. I'll probably be wrong, Geoff, but someone has to say it.
Well, remember, like Jonathan talked about, there are a lot of really good pitchers that you're going to have on the board at 30 and then 39. And then there's a lot of options out there. I mean, the Orioles are the first team to pick second. And Lacy, it's an interesting type pick that you're talking about, because you have to look at the injury history of pitchers who were picked number 2 overall and how they've had to have arm surgeries and things like that. Now, you do bring up the point of, if you could pair Asa Lacy and then Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall, you have Dean Kramer, who's pretty close to making it to the major leagues. You have Keegan Aiken, and then you have a whole batch of others. And then don't forget what's also farther down the pipeline as well. There's a lot of options for what you could do with that pick. But the hope is that you'd be able to keep all those guys healthy. They'd all get to the major leagues right around the same time. But I'm not sure that they go with Lacy for the historical look at it. And also how Mike Elias, when he was in Houston, they decided to make a pick pretty high for a pitcher, didn't end up working out. There's inherent risk, I think, with drafting a college pitcher, even somebody that is as good as an Asa Lacy or an Emerson Hancock, who also pitched in the SEC at the University of Georgia. But I just think that the position player, and also given that, even though it's not your primary concern, but it's just an extra add-on to it, given where your depth is as far as infield positional depth, guys that can hit with power in your system, I just think it makes more sense to go Martin.
And also, I'm sorry, what we heard Jonathan say about Nick Gonzalez, second baseman in New Mexico State, clearly athletically and maybe totality of makeup doesn't match up with Martin and based on college competition, but Gonzalez hit everywhere. And you're talking about someone who you can almost say that guy will be my second baseman sometime in the 2022 season. And, Adley could be in that lineup. Someone like Nick Gonzalez or Austin Martin could be in that lineup. And that's such an organizational need. So there's got to be somewhat of an allure to that also. If you thought he was the better offensive player, if you're Mike Elias, that has to be tempting.
It certainly does, because think about a possible lineup. You have Ryan Mountcastle playing left field. You have Austin Martin or DH. You have Austin Martin playing second base or center field. You shift Austin Hayes around in the outfield. You take your pitching staff, and you've got Grayson Rodriguez, and then we haven't even talked about Mike Baumann. You can put him in there as well. You're being more active on the international market. When you look at guys that have been the top of the heap as far as prospects go, they're coming from the international stage. When you look at a guy like a Ronald Acuna, or right now Wander Franco, who's a member of the Rays organization, expected to be a superstar. He comes from the international market. So you take these high picks for the Orioles, and then you take the fact that they've begun to establish a pretty good international apparatus in which to bring in players, and that'll be the second Super Bowl for the Orioles, is the international signing period. You have a whole lot more depth and a ton of talent that hopefully will sustain your organization for many years to come. And when you're drafting, and when you are also signing players internationally, that's what the goal is. That's what worked for Mike Elias when he was in Houston. And the thing is, if these players are not guys that you use and bring up to your major league team, or maybe they're major leaguers, but they don't quite fit in with your total group of players that are available, then maybe they can be trade pieces as well.
Yeah.
And then they can go to other organizations, because let's face it, Houston used a lot of their homegrown talent to bring in the likes of Justin Verlander and Zach Greinke and some of the other players. And that's a strategy that it doesn't matter if you're a new school or old school GM, lots of people use, and it can be maybe the final things that you do there that help you win a World Series if it's not purely done internally.
I mean, listen, you're going to have holes to fill. You're going to have to supplement everything in some way. And at some point, you have to play the free agent market, whether it means the big fish or small fish. It's impossible to field a 25-man roster of homegrown players. But the point of the story is there's strength in numbers. And the more pieces you have to play, there's a better chance you have to kind of fit an overall better roster in the big leagues. And that's the goal. But listen, it's an opportunity, and it's one the Orioles cannot fail with the second pick and the 30th pick and the 39th pick. They got to walk away with some major leaguers coming up this week. Geoff, we'll have a full draft recap coming up, and we'll continue to break it all down and continue the magic of this Orioles Magic, the podcast.
I think the magic has been taken up a couple of notches with the fact that we are in draft season right now.
I know. I feel really good about draft season. I feel like I'm really zeroing in on this draft to keep my mind busy. At night I'm just pondering the combinations of 2 and 30. All right, Geoff, it's been real. We'll talk some draft. Enjoy it, and we'll catch up soon on Orioles Magic, the podcast presented by Miller Lite.